entire life, it has felt like one day I will wake up and be 50. Life is short has been a saying repeated from all angles. From my perspective, the perspective of a 24-year-old who intellectually knows he is young but feels old, to call life short has only recently begun to ring true. When people look back on 10 years ago and utter the words, "time flies," it is often due to an apparent recognition of who you previously were and what you were doing. To be able to relate to that person separated by a 10-year span must be sickening. However, in your early 20s, you only just begin to understand that nausea. Being 24 years old, 10 years ago does feel like 10 years ago, because at 14 years old, I had not even grown into my body yet. A lot has happened in those 10 years. By 34, I am sure to be different in many ways, but the basic buildings of my character and physicality, despite some added lines on the face and maybe some receding hairline as well, will be a lot more recognisable to the 24-year-old me than the 24-year-old me was to the 14-year-old me. Therefore, in order to truly relate to the idea of life being short, I will need a few more years added on, but I know it's coming and there is nothing I can do to stop it, and before I know it, I'll be 50. The undercurrent of the speeding up of time is the oncoming fate of death. We are all introduced to death at different times in our lives and in different ways. For me, death has only approached those who I had subconsciously prepared to lose. That is not to say that these deaths were less important or any less sad, but I am fortunate enough to still live in that ignorance that comes when life's cruel balancing act hasn't fallen without pre-warning on any family member or friend in the early to mid stages of their lives. Or me, of course. Despite the lack of personal affliction, death is a topic that intrigues me. What happens when we die is the biggest question in this domain. But after a few aimless theories, the logical next step is to apply the concept of death to yourself, which births all the journalistic W's. What will I die of? When will I die? Where will I die? Who will die before or after me? And why do I need to die at all? It is not possible to know the answer, but we can say this: death is a pervasion of life. Whilst it is easy to discard death as something for the future you to deal with, death is something that influences daily decisions. Time is our currency, and the way we spend that time is influenced by the lingering thought of death, whether we realise it or not. The things we buy, the people we spend time with, the lifestyle choices we make, all hold the real finite lifespan they should have, because one day we will all die, so we want to make the best of our time. In knowing our time is finite and truly appreciating it happening to us one day, we can use that certainty of death as motivation for other aspects of our lives. Trivialities can be seen for what they are, ambitious moves towards goals can be made, and people can be brought closer or rightfully pushed away. There is not always a rhyme or reason to death, and to suggest that there is in every case would be ignorant. Yet the undeniable fact of its existence is one that over centuries has slowly been swept under the carpet, arguably making the process of death, dying and being dead harder to digest. When one day the Grim Reaper comes knocking, it would be hard to be prepared, but just being conscious of the Reaper itself has shown to have its own benefits. That is what this video is an attempt to be then, a way to exercise that reality to my advantage and to help influence the fledgling aspects of my life in the process. By going deep into the concepts of death, a clearer pervasion will form and influence me positively. Therefore, the next time you are asked why you meditate on death, reply only with this: because life is short. Before researching this video, I was under the impression that obtaining a reliable definition of what death is would be easy. Little did I know that this would not be the case. To sum up death as broadly and objectively as possible, death is the irreversible cessation of life. This definition would appear to be sufficient. However, being able to legally define a person's death can be more complicated than you would be led to believe. In the UK and a high majority of states in the US, the way a person is declared legally dead is through brain death. This way of measuring the transition between life and death was introduced in the 1980s. Prior to then, death was determined by the cessation of a person's circulatory and respiratory systems, also known as cardiopulmonary cessation, but there was one issue with declaring someone's death purely down to a lack of a beating heart or heaving lungs by the mid-1900s, and this was the introduction of the cardiopulmonary resuscitation, also known as CPR. While CPR has been used, admittedly in various ways, since the late 1800s, the modern way of CPR began in the 1950s. Now it was possible to bring people back whose heart and lungs had momentarily ceased to work, which led to doctors and nurses demanding a change in definition to what should be considered as legally dead. To some it may seem almost irrelevant to argue this. Surely if someone was dead, they could see it for themselves, right? That is true, but as modern technology continued to advance throughout the 1960s and 70s, with the arrival of ventilators, feeding tubes, and respirators, the confusion over whether a person is or isn't considered dead by the state could complicate the processes that occur following the death of a person. These processes could include determining the person's time of death, inheritance, organ donations, and could even affect criminal cases, as a suspect could not be tried for murder if the victim has not been legally declared dead. Therefore, after many a hoo-ha, the Uniform Determination of Death Act was presented in 1980. It defined death as such: an individual who has sustained either 1. Irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or 2. Irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem, is dead. A determination of death must be made in accordance with accepted medical standards. This definition is held under these two words: brain death. Today, brain death is the universal determination of a person's transition from life to death. It is also worth mentioning that the former distinction of defining death can be used, but today is referred to as clinical death. Sherwin B. Nuland, a decades-long American surgeon and writer of the medical profession, defined clinical death in his 1994 book, How We Die. Clinical death is the term used to encompass that short interval after the heart has finally stopped, during which there is no circulation, no breathing, and no evidence of brain function, but when rescue is still possible. Whilst brain death and the aforementioned definition laid out by the UDDA is commonly accepted in the US, there have been some states that have not accepted it entirely. For example, the state of New Jersey does not stick wholly to the UDDA definition when determining whether a person is dead. On April 8, 1991, the New Jersey Declaration of Death Act was signed, and despite the Act adhering to the usual brain death definition introduced by the UDDA, the Act also allowed exemptions for those who felt the declaration was infringing on their religious rights. If the physician has a reason to believe, on the basis of information in the individual's available medical records or information provided by the family or others, that the individual's personal religious beliefs would be violated by the declaration of death upon the basis of the neurological criteria, then the death of the individual shall be declared and the time of death fixed solely upon the basis of cardiorespiratory criteria. Despite the attempts made to objectively define death, we also must consider the further complicating fact that the way we value life also determines how we individually determine death. In an article by Ben Sarby called Definitions of Death, Brain Death and What Matters in a Person, Sarby argues that our medical definitions of death clash with our values. Sarby suggests that we should consider our own values of what makes a person who they are, in order to understand when death is irreversible. With the daily advances in the medical world, the questions regarding what makes a person who they are must be asked when considering using life support. In doing so, Sarby details the higher brain standard, which is the idea that a whole brain need not be the baseline criteria for a person's death, but instead, just those parts of the brain that constitute as part of the person's personality. In a person, the self is the mind, which in some way will be his brain. The organism is the body, which is not essential to who a person is. For the higher brain theorists, what matters is the death of a particular part of the brain, namely the death of the cerebral hemispheres, as those areas are what constitute the key parts of what make us into selves. Our memories, consciousness, beliefs, desires, and overall psychology. The death of the total brain is sufficient for brain death, but under this standard, not necessary. The death of certain key parts of the brain is what matters. And thus, the complications surrounding the proper definition and declaration of legal death were made that way via modern technology. We are privileged to be able to have these discussions. The ways we value life in the modern world is incredibly different to the people of years past. Before modern medicine that allowed us to fret about definitions, people's potential for death was a lot higher and often more final. Additionally, life's fragility was a lot more apparent daily. Whereas today we hide our dead away in hospice, in the past the dead and dying were impossible to miss. People did not die in the hands of strangers, they died in the houses they had once been healthy and living, surrounded by those they shared that life with. The frequent and unavoidable confrontations with death was a healthy reminder of their fate, a way to throw aside the day's issues or triumphs. And this reminder was also self-imposed. Memento Mori was the phrase used to encapsulate this remembrance. Memento Mori is Latin for remember you will die, and is propped up in many cultures throughout the ages. On the surface it may seem to be a grim reminder and a reminder not worth bringing up. However, to many, Memento Mori was an antidote to the pressures of life. The phrase has been adopted by many societies through history, but the general concept remains the same. Daily reminders of your mortality that help to put the good and bad of life into a grander perspective. On impulse, people tend to view Memento Mori as a philosophical antidote to a problem in one's life. That is a valid reason to use the phrase, of course. However, it can also be used to retain humility in your moments of greatest success. It is believed that Memento Mori originated from an ancient Roman tradition. Following a successful military conquest, military generals responsible for the recent victory would be paraded around in a chariot to a wealth of adoring onlookers. However, riding in the chariot just behind the military general would be a slave whose job it was to whisper this in his ear: "Look behind, remember thou art mortal, remember you must die." This quote was originally said in Latin, but I do not want to butcher it. The purpose of a slave's whisperings was to remind the general that no matter the accolades or achievements of your life, your end fate is always death. Now, whilst that anecdote is not confirmed as true, the idea of this reminder of your own mortality has been practiced throughout the ages. The concept of Memento Mori was adopted heavily by the Stoics. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius would remind himself of his mortality every day. During his time as emperor, from 161 to 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius would write to himself about a manner of Stoic principles that helped him to cope with the daily responsibilities of his power. Years after his death, these writings of Marcus Aurelius would be discovered and published under the name Meditations. In the book, Marcus Aurelius writes on the importance of remembering your own mortality. You could leave right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. Another renowned Stoic philosopher called Seneca practiced the same thing. Let us prepare our minds as if we'd come to the very end of life. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. The one who puts the finishing touches on their life each day is never short of time. Memento Mori can also be found in the artist of distant past too. Take this 1646 painting, Still Life with a Skull. The painting is a Veneta painting, a term used to distinguish the art style associated with Memento Mori-like depictions. The use of the skull situated between the flower and hourglass is not an accident. The flower is life, hourglass time, and skull death. Like all other examples, this art piece is a reminder that death is the fate of us all, no matter your wealth, status, or beauty. Thus, the purpose of Memento Mori can vary. Whether you're navigating the most difficult time of your life or finding yourself winning in all aspects, Memento Mori is a mental leveler that puts all into perspective. Good or bad, it will not last. How you want to interpret that is up to you. Personally, I find it liberating. When things don't go my way and frustrations arise, Memento Mori is a motivator to not get stifled in the letdowns of life. Bigger letdowns will come. Parents and friends, and eventually you will die. It is a clearer of fog that may not hold all the answers, but at least convinces me to keep searching for them. And so, considering we have had all this talk on death, we have only so far approached death from our side, the side of life, the living. We have looked at it from the exterior and not strayed too close. We know the look of the cave, where the cave is, and what to call it, but we haven't gone into it. So that leads me to the question, what happens when we are dead? Newsflash, nobody truly knows, but we can hear some fascinating tales from those who have come close to finding out through the investigative mortality measure of a near-death experience. On a sunny June afternoon in 2020, war correspondent Sebastian Junger had a near-death experience that saw him experience unexplainable visions that altered his perception of the concept of an afterlife. Prior to this event, Junger had been through many deadly experiences in his professional life. Junger had begun war corresponding in the early 1990s as a freelancer. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Junger had made a name for himself due to the release of books such as The Perfect Storm, Fire, War, and Tribe. Junger was intrigued by dangerous jobs and the humanity of those who worked them, which kept him returning to war-torn countries time and time again. Junger eventually stopped war corresponding after the death of his good friend and collaborator Tim Hetherington. Hetherington had most notably collaborated with Younger to make the award-winning documentary Restrepo. On a trip to cover the Libyan civil war that Younger was supposed to attend at the time, Hetherington would wind up getting killed in April of 2011. Upon hearing the news, Younger quit war corresponding. It seemed as if the most dangerous periods of Younger's life had come to an end. That was until that June afternoon. Whilst mid-conversation with his wife on the front porch of a cabin in the woods him and his family were staying at, Younger felt a sharp pain in his stomach that stopped him mid-sentence. Within minutes, Younger couldn't stand up. 10 minutes later, he began to go blind. Younger had suffered an aneurysm in his pancreas. After being rushed into an ambulance and taken to a hospital an hour away, Younger led on a gurney whilst doctors and nurses swarmed around him. As the commotion continued, Younger looked down to his left and saw a black pit that felt as if it was sucking him in. Suddenly, above Younger appeared his father, who had died in 2012. Younger's father began to comfort Younger as his fear increased and his consciousness slipped away. It was at this moment that Younger turned to the doctor, opening his neck, and said, "You're losing me right now. You've got to hurry." As is obvious, Younger survived this ordeal, but it was close. According to the doctors, he lost 90% of his blood into his abdomen and was 10 minutes away from dying. In fact, it was a miracle he had survived at all. It was one of life's great ironies that a war journalist would suffer his closest experience to death on a peaceful June afternoon with his family. On the event, Younger said this: "I've been going to front lines my whole life, other people's front lines. Finally, the front lines came to me." Whilst Younger relayed the experiences of what would appear to be some evidence of some sort of afterlife, Younger is quick to point out that he is an atheist, with no spiritual beliefs that would encourage any ideas of life after death. Experiences such as Younger's have been recorded throughout history. In Nulland's How We Die, he details one of the possibilities of these types of hallucinations. Nulland explains how when we become close to death, the body instinctually knows to release endorphins that help to stabilize the mind of him or her that is close to dying. Nulland talks about the mystical quality of stories of people reaching the verge of death and subsequently experiencing events that seem unexplainable and perhaps supernatural. In the normal, non-stressed, non-injured person, there is no evidence of the pain-relieving and mood-altering action of endorphins. It requires some definitive degree of trauma, whether physical or emotional, for them to swing into action. The level, or even the quality, of the necessary trauma has not yet been ascertained. Nulland relays the stories of people like Michel de Montaigne, who was struck by a horse and felt an unusual sense of calm, or the story of Katie Mason, a child murdered in the street by a 39-year-old knife-wielding schizophrenic man, who had a face of immense calm when she was found by her mother. Lastly, Nulland also recounts his own story. Nulland was terrified of water, and one day whilst abroad had fallen into a lake fully clothed. Instead of panicking, Nulland waited to hit the bottom and kicked his way back up. He recounts, once again, an unusual sense of calm. Nulland explains how these states of serenity could be a defensive mechanism for making smart decisions in times of crisis, as well as toning down the intensity of death itself. When a life-threatening situation occurs, the body knows to release endorphins to increase the chance for survival. Near-death experiences may offer an insight to what happens when we die, but in reality, we will never know until we get there ourselves. On the religious side, the two most notable beliefs concerning an afterlife are reincarnation and the concept of heaven and hell. The former is the belief in the idea that we are a soul in the cycle of life, and what we do in previous lives influences the life we move on to next. This is known as karma, which can be attained through gracious acts. It is also worth mentioning that in these cycles you can come back as anything ranging from a bug to a human. Reincarnation also gives the soul transferring through all these lives the ability to be liberated, also known as moksha. The latter, heaven and hell, is likely much more well known to viewers of this channel. The former is a paradise reserved for those who live their life on earth in a virtuous way in tandem with Christian principles. The latter, hell, is for those who do the opposite. In hell, you will be subjected to an eternity of damnation with Satan as your companion. Maybe Younger was staring at the pits of hell in that hospital in June 2020. Probably not though, he seems like a good guy. Although if I was him, I'd be a bit worried. Death is a broad subject that can be tackled from a lot of angles, and here I have tried to throw in as many as I could. However, there are many dead ends and empty theories in death because, as I've reiterated many times, only those who know the answers are dead. Moving forward then, I believe it would be easier to focus on the dying. In saying this, I don't mean the biological process of a body and mind in decline, but instead the lessons that can be learnt from those who are reaching the finishing line. Because let's face it, death is not the scary part, dying is. Dying is where the pain happens, and the confrontation with mortality is at its most intense. Unless we are struck down by an unsuspecting illness or exterior factor, and if so, I hope those fucking endorphins kick in, the process of dying will fix into perspective what was important to us and what wasn't. For some, dying consists of fear and regret, an unavoidable feeling of a life not well lived. Yet, for others, those who fulfilled their life's purpose, dying was less painful due to the quality of years that preceded that tail end. Maybe with a little research and inspiration, we can all someday be the latter. When we are born, the process of dying begins. If we are lucky, that process continues into old age. Like the process of defining death, the process of dying in old age is steeped in debate. In Nulland's How We Die, in the chapter titled Doors to Death of the Aged, he underlines some of the theories regarding our understanding of why people deteriorate with age. The first is the wear and tear theory, which considers the unavoidable damage that occurs to the body's cells and organs by its environment. By environment, the theory refers both to the exterior environment of the outside world and the environment within the body itself. The second is the theory that there exists for us all a predetermined genetic lifespan. Our parents, therefore, are to thank and/or blame for the length of years we are granted, should you successfully dodge any outside fatal factor. Nulland explains how every patient needs a terminal tag to explain their passing. Putting old age in cause of death would never be deemed an adequate cause. Everybody is required to die of a named entity, by order not only of the Department of Health and Human Services, but also of the global fiat of the World Health Organization. In 35 years as a licensed physician, I have never had the temerity to write old age on a death certificate, knowing that the form would be returned to me with a terse note from some official record keeper informing me that I had broken the law. Everywhere in the world, it is illegal to die of old age. In needing a tag, however, Nulland details how these diagnoses prior to the elderly patient's death can prevent the old from dying in a comfortable manner due to a relentless and frankly hopeless pursuit in curing whatever tag they have been labelled with. The cure might be achievable, but fundamentally, the patient's expiry date is still due, and the quality of life is gone. To strengthen this point, Nulland and his friend Dr. G.J. Walker Smith, who was the director of the autopsy service at Yale New Haven Hospital, read through 23 records of deceased elderly patients. In these records, there were 12 men and 11 women. The average age was 88, with the oldest patient being 95. The patients had all died in various ways. What Nulland and Smith found was that all the patients had an advanced atherosclerosis, a disease that is survivable for a young or middle-aged person, but not for the ages involved in these records. It seemed then that the varying illnesses that got to these patients were the first in line. Their biological clock was running out, and it was a matter of what would get there first. The lesson taught by the 23 case histories is simply confirmation of the lesson that daily experience teaches. Whether it is the anarchy of disordered biochemistry or the direct result of its opposite, a carefully orchestrated genetic ride to death, we die of old age because we have been worn and torn and programmed to cave in. The very old do not succumb to disease, they implode their way into eternity. These debates regarding the body's biological limit bring with them moral questions. Is it right to keep those alive when the cure arguably brings on more suffering than the cause of dying? I am not the person to answer that question. I am no doctor, and evidently these questions must be approached on a case-by-case basis. Additionally, we naturally want to be in denial when a loved one is in decline, so to pull the plug early is a hard choice. Denial will come from many aspects, and it is a topic I will be returning to soon. But one of the ways in which we can soften the blow of dying and minimize denial in the process is through the quality of the genetic ride preceding those declining days. I previously mentioned the philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who had been struck off his horse unexpectedly, and, having experienced a tranquil state during the clash, had resolved himself to die. What makes this anecdote one of importance is in the 30+ years of fear Montaigne had lived in prior to it happening. Montaigne was a sensitive man who experienced many tragic deaths within the first half of his life. He was notoriously fearful of dying, a fear exacerbated by the death of his best friend, his father, and his younger brother. By his late 30s, Montaigne had become jaded. He had left his job and decided to live in solitude where he would write about his thoughts. In the process, he developed and named the essay, and would continue writing these essays on his thoughts in the process. Within these essays, the horse anecdote was relayed. However, it is in the essay that to study philosophy is to learn to die that he expresses his thoughts on living successfully. Wherever your life ends, it is all there. The utility of living consists not in the length of days, but in the use of time. A man may have lived long, and yet lived but a little. Make use of time while it is present with you. It depends upon your will, and not upon the number of days, to have a sufficient length of life. It is in the pursuit of this use of time where hope can be found. Nullen talks on this too. It is the significance of the days you live that give you hope, not the hope of modern medicine keeping you around for longer. The greatest dignity to be found in death is the dignity of the life that preceded it. This is a form of hope we can all achieve, and it is the most abiding of all. Hope resides in the meaning of what our lives have been. But how can this be accomplished? Understandably, living your life in a meaningful way is not as simple as it sounds. Some people do not know what they want, who they want to be, where they want to go. That is something that can only be discovered through random acts of action. If you are one of those people, I would advise throwing yourself into something that even to a small degree piques your interest. What I've found through doing this is that it likely will not develop a clear answer, but it will knock off a potential candidate. Just because you try something and it does not work, it does not mean it was a waste of time. Think of it as having been a necessary part of the process towards finding what it is. You threw yourself into something and were reflected in a different direction, hopefully a more suitable one. If I were to throw my 2 cents into the debate of what makes for a fulfilled genetic ride, I would say the answer lies within a balance between professional and personal accomplishments. This may seem obvious, but it is easy to sway too far one way or another. The misconception of chasing goals can often be found in the sacrificing of some unknowingly important element for a seemingly important one. If the balance between the two can be negotiated healthily, you're winning. Ask yourself this: when I'm on my deathbed, what do I want to have got done, and who do I want in the room? Do not sacrifice one for the other. Don't neglect your relationships, but don't throw away your ambition entirely. Obsess a little less with both. The achievement of these accomplishments come at a hefty price. A price much more boring than the heroic pursuit of one's goals. The dropping of bad habits, addictions, anxieties, and fears. Baggage is accumulated through living, and if left long enough, becomes a natural part of the weight we carry on a daily basis. We forget the times when we didn't have these burrowing shoulder straps. Yet these flaws are what set you up for dissatisfaction at the tail end of life. Like a ship that points mere centimeters in one direction, the longer you leave it to correct that mistake, the further off course you will become. Charles Bukowski's The Shoelace poem speaks to these subtle annoyances that burn you out. He speaks on how we are prepared for the calamities of life, like robbery, death, and incest, but it is the little unnoticed things that accumulate over time. It is these small things that direct you off course and into the arms of dissatisfaction, whatever form that may take. A small anxiety or fear can keep you grounded for years, only to be realized for the non-entity it is, only when it is too late. And that is what happens to those who stress over the length of the days. These men and women thus die physically old but mentally young, feeling as if they had just started getting a grasp of which had for them now reached its end. An honest, stoical, and detailed account of one's wrestling with the certainty of death can be found in the book Mortality by writer and journalist Christopher Hitchens. Whilst on tour to promote his memoir Hitch 22, Hitchens had suffered a debilitating pain in his chest and thorax. Ironically, as if predestined, Hitchens had been promoting his chronicling of the last 60 years he had spent on Earth, and the cosmos thanked him by giving him 18 more months to live. Hitchens was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, the same thing that had killed his father at the age of 79. Determined to make something of this news, Hitchens began writing about his journey to the land of the sick in a column in Vanity Fair. Hitchens would unfortunately succumb to his cancer on the 15th of December 2011 at the age of 62. The writing that appeared in Vanity Fair would be collected into the book Mortality, which would be released on the 25th of August 2012. The book contains a foreword by friend Graydon Carter and an afterword by Hitchens' wife Carol Blue. The book opens as such. I have more than once in my life woken up feeling like death, but nothing prepared me for the early morning in June when I came to consciousness, feeling as if I were actually shackled to my own corpse. The whole cave of my chest and thorax seemed to have been hollowed out and then refilled with slow drying cement. In the book, Hitchens describes his cancer by comparing it to an alien that had unknowingly transported him from the side of the well to that of the sick. The chapters and the book itself are short, and in usual Hitchens style, he commented upon his likely demise with stoical humour. Hitchens describes the odd double life you take when terminally sick, one of both preparing to die and striving to survive. Lawyers preparing inheritances in the morning, doctors poking and prodding in the afternoon, every day. He also makes mention of the humorous ways people would interact with him as a dying man. Some would approach Hitchens with gentle prodding, others would do so without such delicacy. An example of the latter is shown whilst Hitchens is chatting to a friend about not being able to attend his niece's wedding in England due to his illness. His close friend then added to the misery with the question, "Is it you're afraid you'll never see England again?" A fair question, Hitchens concedes, but this question also held the faint idea that maybe the cold hard facts of this ordeal should be monopolised by those who have to deal with them directly. Hitchens' biggest fear after being diagnosed was losing his ability to write, as he viewed his writing not as something he did, but as a part of him as a person. He was not a man who wrote, he was a writer. Sadly, towards the end, this final blow would be placed. As the book progresses, the writing becomes more fragmented. The final chapter contains unfinished jottings from Hitchens not long before he died. In these musings, Hitchens talks about losing weight, the tributes, the good and the bad, that he received, the weekly column of another British journalist who was dying of cancer a few years back, and lastly, Hitchens continues to argue his case against religion. Earlier in the book, Hitchens notes the plans he had felt had been abruptly interrupted by his sickness, as well as the realisation of all the things he would either miss or never see/read again. Rage would be beside the point for the same reason. Instead, I am badly oppressed by the gnawing sense of waste. I had real plans for my next decade and felt I'd worked hard enough to earn it. Will I really not live to see my children married, to watch the World Trade Center rise again, to read, if not indeed to write, the obituaries of elderly villains like Henry Kissinger and Joseph Ratzinger? But I understand this sort of non-thinking for what it is: sentimentality and self-pity. For those who are familiar with Christopher Hitchens, you would be aware of his arguments against religion and his love of excess. Hitchens had lived a bohemian life in his younger years and experienced fascinating events. He travelled to many countries, wrote and sold many books, and spent many of his years pursuing his passion, writing. A lifestyle colourfully permeated with drink and smokes. However, despite the good times, Hitchens knew his lifestyle was a taunt towards the Reaper. A good majority of his life was spent battering his body, and it had caught up to him. Yet, when asked about the bohemian lifestyle that had led to his life being cut short, he would agree that he had burnt the candle at both ends, but that it had left a lovely light. Mortality is a meditation of the dimming of that light. It is neither glorious nor self-pitying. It is a reflection on what simply is. Instead of worrying about what he maybe should or should not have done, Hitchens takes an unsympathetic view of his situation. Hitchens' ability to view himself as a person to pity is due to the years he had spent living a life designed for him. He had established himself as a credible writer, he had a good social group around him, and a family he loved. Dying then, whilst evidently never being an easy endeavour, was made easier to approach objectively and stoically due to those quality years whose length had been cut short. In one way, I suppose, I have been in denial for some time, knowingly burning the candle at both ends and finding that it often gives a lovely light. But for precisely that reason, I can't see myself smitting my brow with shock or hear myself whining about how it's all so unfair. I have been taunting the Reaper into taking a free skive in my direction, and have now succumbed to something so predictable and banal that it bores even me. The idea of denial when dying is an intriguing concept. It is, at first, an understandable response. Dying will never be easy to cope with. Nuland himself speaks to the frank nature of humans when faced with the end. Denial is a significant factor, for example, in the surprising frequency with which dying people refuse to confront the nearness of circumstances they anticipated when, while still healthy, they signed advance directives prohibiting major resuscitative efforts. When the chips are down, almost no one wants his life to end, and one good way for the conscious mind to avoid it is for the unconscious mind to deny that it is about to happen. Denial is going to be something we all experience if given the facts of our demise. However, where denial can also be found, and arguably at its most harmful, is when those around the bedside of the sick are unable to comprehend the dying person in the bed. Nuland explains how denial can make the process harder for the dying because the lack of acknowledgement concerning the reality of the situation can isolate the person going through it. In denying this reality, the slot of time that should be used up in a final consummation is squandered in the pursuit of shielding the dying and themselves from the grim finite reality of death. Unless we are aware that we are dying and so far as possible know the conditions of our death, we cannot share any sort of final consummation with those who love us. Without this consummation, no matter their presence at the hour of passing, we will remain unattended and isolated. The fear of dying influences our inability to properly acknowledge its end, particularly on those closest to us. Yet, if we are to perfect the art of living through seizing opportunities, thwarting anxieties, and by truly confronting and moving towards what fulfills us in our lives, then the scary process of dying can be relieved somewhat. Through the undeniable knowledge of the years preceding your decline being wrung out in goals reached, families held together, and time well spent, dying can be eased. This is an idealist approach, of course. Evidently, not every day can be lived as if it was your last, as the old saying goes. But, on a daily basis, minor adjustments can be made. Then, hope for the future can be found not in those years ahead, but how they will be spent. A life of quality over quantity. If you achieve both, count your lucky stars. The appearance of a newly dead, lifeless face cannot be mistaken for unconsciousness. Within a minute after the heart stops beating, the face begins to take on the unmistakable grey-white pallor of death. In an uncanny way, the features very soon appear corpse-like, even to those who have never before seen a dead body. When someone dies, the other ones left behind are not given time to grieve. Now the person has passed, a frightening automatic proactive duty sets in to the immediate family that pushes them on to the arrangements of the funeral. The day of the funeral rolls around, the deceased is celebrated and mourned. Anecdotes are told, a eulogy is read, and eventually the deceased is placed in the ground or turned into ashes. Friends and family begin to leave in queues towards the final comfort, the wake. It is usually within this time frame that the death seems at its most digestible. The tributes pour in, the death is held aloft, and most importantly, there is work to be done, arrangements to be made. Yet when that process ends, the true grieving starts. Now everyone has gone back to their lives, resuming as they had done before. The loss of that one person is more significant. You wake up, the sun is out, people go to work, the shop's open, the sky is blue, but there is one small disorientating tilt that paints everything an unfamiliar colour. That one person isn't there anymore. That's when grief sets in. In 1961, author C.S. Lewis released a small book called A Grief Observed. The book was originally published under the pseudonym N.W. Clark, and the subject of which this Clark grieved was put simply as H. In reality, H was Helen Joy Davidman, an American writer who had started a relationship with Lewis that ended tragically. The two had been friends and had originally had a civil marriage to allow Joy to escape her abusive husband in America. However, the two formed a closer bond over time, and once Joy developed cancer, Lewis decided he wanted another wedding that would be blessed by the church. This happened in March 1957. Joy would subsequently go into remission, giving the pair some time together where their bond grew even stronger. But unfortunately, the cancer returned, and Joy would die in July 1960. Lewis was devastated by the loss and took to writing about his pain in what would become A Grief Observed. It begins as such. No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning, I keep on swallowing. At other times it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting, yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. As may seem obvious, the book is about the immediate emotional aftermath of the loss of joy. In the book, Lewis, a deeply religious man, talks about his struggles with God, wondering not if he exists, but if he is in fact a cruel person. Much like Hitchens experienced as a dying man, Lewis comments on the unsure way in which he is approached by everyone who knows about his recent loss. He describes the embarrassment he feels as his friends awkwardly contemplate whether to tell him they are sorry for his loss or to pretend it hasn't happened. As I said at the start of this video, I would be lying to say I've experienced the agony of grief on the level Lewis has, or anyone who has lost anybody unsuspectingly and very close to them. However, I do relate to the role of the friends witnessing the grieving process in motion. It's hard because you don't want to appear to be tarnishing the grieving with a brush of their own misery, but simultaneously, you don't want to be unfeeling or make the grieving feel isolated. An odd byproduct of my loss is that I'm aware of being an embarrassment to everyone I meet. At work, at the club, in the street, I see people as they approach me, trying to make up their minds whether they'll say something about it or not. I hate it if they do, and if they don't. On the third part of the book, Lewis begins to notice a change in his mood, a feeling of lightness and a rest of the grey cloud. He finds that in not desperately clinging on to her memory, he remembers joy the most. He likens this to the idea of wanting something so much you cannot get the best out of it. It's like, as Lewis states, trying to have a good talk that falls apart, or telling yourself you're going to get a good night's sleep and subsequently remaining awake for hours. Lewis thus begins to see his lack of response from God as coming from his frantic knocking on God's door. Like a drowning man thrashing in the sea, unable to be saved through fear of bringing his saviors down with him, Lewis was too hysterical to hear the words of God. But as time would pass on and the pain subtly subsides, Joy's memory appears clearer to Lewis than ever. In not clinging on to every moment they shared, he finds that he remembers more. The clarity discovered through Lewis's ability to let go brings some potential reasonings behind why his grief fills him with fear and restlessness. I think I am beginning to understand why grief feels like suspense. It comes from the frustration of so many impulses that have become habitual. Thought after thought, feeling after feeling, action after action, had H for their object. Now their target is gone. I keep on through habit fitting an arrow to the string. Then I remember and have to lay the bow down. So many roads lead thought to H. I set out on one of them, but now there's an impassable frontier post across it. So many roads once. Now so many cul-de-sacs. This feeling of suspense is similarly displayed in writer Joan Didion's memoir on the loss of her husband. Published in 2005, the book is called The Year of Magical Thinking. On the 30th of December 2003, Joan Didion and her husband John Gregory Doone returned to their New York apartment following a visit to the Beth Israel North Hospital. For the past few days, their daughter Quintana Rue Doone had been in and out of hospital due to health complications, and the pair had just returned from an all too familiar visit. Upon entering their apartment, Joan started a fire and began making dinner whilst John sat in the living room, drinking scotch and reading Europe's Last Summer, Who Started the Great War in 1914. Despite the obvious, the evening was like none other. John continued to read in his chair whilst Joan cooked, a seeming return to normalcy to help ease the devastation happening on the 6th floor ICU at Beth Israel North. The two sat down to dinner and began talking about Scotch and World War I. John was the initiator of both topics, which he spoke on as Joan fixated her gaze on the food and on the table. But then the chatter stops. Joan looked up and saw John with one arm in the air, in silence. Joan rushed over to him, assuming he was choking, and applied the Heimlich maneuver. John fell forward into the table and onto the floor. Joan then called an ambulance. The paramedics came. John was defibrillated and placed in an ambulance. Once at the hospital, John was sent off on a gurney, and a social worker, after pointing towards Joan whilst facing one of the paramedics and saying, "Is this the wife?" delivered the news. John was dead. Thus begins what Joan Didion would describe as her year of magical thinking. Like A Grief Observed, Didion's book focuses on the effects of grief. Didion, however, takes a more objective approach, choosing to come at the topic like she did all the other topics she wrote about in her life prior. Like a journalist. There are a few notable similarities between the year of magical thinking and a grief observed. One of those is in the descriptions of grief itself. Both writers describe grief as something that comes and goes. It is not a sensation that is continuously inflicting itself on a person, but an intense interval of dread that randomly pounces on you and brings you for a ride, only to recede once again. Lewis compares grief to a circle bomber dropping its attacks intermittently, whilst Didion uses the imagery of waves. Grief is different. Grief has no distance. Grief comes in waves, paroxysms, sudden apprehensions that weaken the knees and blind the eye and obliterate the dailiness of life. Virtually everyone who has ever experienced grief mentions this phenomenon of waves. Another similarity is in the aforementioned feeling of suspense and restlessness that comes along with grief. Didion comments on how her grief surprised her with how irrational it made her thought process. Not irrational in the sense of acting out in aggression, but more the delusion it put her under. Didion speaks on an outwardly cool demeanour, but completely irrational interior. An interior that held on to the clothes of her husband on the off chance he may return. The very last notable similarity I wanted to touch upon was the topic of self-pity. There was a noticeable self-flogging done by Didion, Lewis and also Hitchens. Something about the intrusion of death into the lives of all three writers had them talking on self-pity and how they were determined not to succumb to it. Self-pity is a common theme in death. It is seen as shameful. My theory is that we are taught at an early age that death is coming, to us and to our families. I think this knowing of death almost convinces us that we should not feel sorry for ourselves because we knew without fault it was bound to arrive eventually. But now death has arrived and we're understandably upset, there is a certain level of, well, I knew that was going to happen, why do I feel so bad about it? Unfortunately though, you cannot intellectualize your way out of pain. The same way a baseball bat to the head won't hurt less because you knew it was coming before it wrapped itself around your skull. Of the three though, Didion is the only writer who expands on self-pity and acknowledges its unattractive quality, yet does not say it should be thrown away entirely, and as she should too. Didion had every right to feel sorry for herself at that time. In low doses, self-pity can be useful. In grief, only you truly know how you feel. Therefore, offering yourself up as a person to be sad with makes more sense than offering yourself to someone who, despite their best intentions, just simply does not understand. Not that they cannot help in some other way, but they just don't get it like you do. In fact, the grieving have urgent reasons, even an urgent need to feel sorry for themselves. Husbands walk out, wives walk out, divorces happen, but these husbands and wives leave behind them webs of intact associations, however acrimonious. Only the survivors of a death are truly left alone. And so, with everything said, with the definitions of death, philosophies surrounding death, near-death experiences, afterlives, trying to live right, grief, self-pity, etc., etc., I think the last question to ask is the most direct one. Why do we die? Despite all the add-ons, why do we have to go? Now, I am not able to answer that question from a spiritual perspective. Unfortunately, I am not wired that way. And so when approaching a question like that, I have to think practically. I believe Nullen explains it best though. Fantasies of staying the hand of mortality are incompatible with the best intentions of our species and the continuity of humankind's progress. More directly, they are incompatible with the best interests of our very own children. To put it simply, the reason we die is to make room for the next generation. It would be selfish to want to overstay our welcome. In my opinion, an older figure, whether a sibling, parent, or grandparent, has a duty to leave this earth with their younger family members strong enough to cope with their death. In doing this, a tragic death could be made less tragic through developing strong characters who don't succumb to self-destruction when that inevitable end rolls around. When people die, you can only honour their life through how you live your own. Don't allow misery to open the door to destructive coping mechanisms if you can. Use death as a catalyst for change, in outlook, values, in what you want to get out of life. Use that bastard death as a reason to shake it up. On death, dying and being dead. We all know the former. The centre we are in the act of doing now. The latter, we will all be soon enough.